In this video, we'll talk about juicing, how to make an attack like this feel good. Juicing is the process of layering little effects, animations, fine-tuning the sounds to make the game feel better. Without juicing, this attack looks and feels like this. It's functional, it's working, as you can see from the enemy pushback, but it really feels dull. You can barely feel the impact, and the game feels lifeless. In this video, we're going to see the layers that make up this sword slash. We're not going to teach you how to make a basic animation or all the steps to create every effect you see here. However, if you'd like to learn more about any of that, please let me know in the comments below. This demo is free and open source. You can find it along with the others on our website. You'll find a link in the description below. This video is sponsored by our Godot courses. More on that at the end. Let's start back at the beginning when the sword doesn't feel very good. What we have here is when I click, the sword plays an animation, rotating the sprite and its collision shape, as you can see here. So I have the sword scene open right here, and we're going to start by focusing on the rotation. What's happening at the beginning is something like this. We have a track to rotate the sprite of the sword. So it starts rotated back, and then it rotates a little over 200 degrees and goes back to its neutral starting position. Note that we rotate the sprite, and so this rotation is relative to the sword's pivot, allowing us to cut at every angle. If I turn the pivot down, for example, I can slice down like this. I'm going to reset the pivot rotation. And so this animation has a couple of problems. The first one is that if we step through the frames, we can see that the sword moves at constant space interval. So there's no sense of acceleration or weight to the attack, and it goes back the same way. It feels really, really weak. Also, it instantly starts back, which gameplay-wise is a good thing, because as soon as you press the attack key, you want to be attacking already. But still, sometimes here it feels a bit strange when playing the game, when you have the thing in hand, and sometimes it's good to have one frame or a split second where the sword goes back and then slices down like this. And I found that for this sword, this was necessary. So here's the next iteration. I'm going to hide the trail for now, where I have a couple more keys. So at the start of the animation, the sword is at its neutral position. It then, over a split second, goes back and then slices down, accelerating, as you can see, and then it stays a little bit down before going back up. Here's the difference. You can see there's a bit more weight to the animation. This is thanks to the first two keyframes of the animation, though note that pulling a weapon back like this, it's called an anticipation, adds a bit of weight to your animation, but it also adds input lag to your combat system. The animation starts as soon as the player presses the attack key, but then for a split second the sword will go back before slashing down. And that time is time the player is not exactly attacking. So you want to keep that in mind. Then we add a sword trail. I'm going to show you what it does by reactivating the trail track. When I attack with it, you can see the white element behind the sword. This is without. You can see it makes quite a bit of difference. I'm going to deselect the node, the sprite node. This animation is pretty simple. We have a sprite that's like this, that is attached to the sword sprite so that it rotates with the sword. And in the animation, all we do is make it visible for a short amount of time, for a split second there again. It helps to read the sword attack. Having a trail tends to slow down the animation slightly, and makes it a bit easier to see. It's also called a smear in animation. An important next element is adding some particles because we have an ice sword, as you can see here. So we've made a couple of particles that make snowflakes go down. They use a very simple snowflake sprite, and the particles will make them scale down. I can show you that on the material of the particle system. The main things we do is give it a little bit of gravity, a little variation in the direction, but this is really minor. The box extents of the emission shape make the snowflakes fall down from the length of the sword blade. And finally, we have, well, a couple more properties, but the main one that makes a difference is the scale. You can see we use a curve that makes the snowflakes grow big and then disappear by scaling down. The next layer of juice comes from the enemy. When we attack the enemy, we want them to react a bit more. And for that, we create another animation. So I'm on the enemy scene and I have a hit animation, which we could also call stagger. And in there, I'm going to animate the rotation and also make the enemy flash. So first the rotation, that's the enemy taking a hit. It's rotating back and forth, and it gives you some feedback that you hit the enemy already, right? It makes a big difference. And then we flash the enemy using the enemy's shader material. So we flash it white like this. So this makes it even clearer that you hit something. The next thing that we add are particles. These particles, the hit particles, they spawn some bubbles from the enemy. A very simple texture, a white circle. And the notable things in this particle system are that it's one shot. So it's going to play only once upon turning on emitting. And its explosiveness is cranked up. So if we crank the explosiveness back down to 0, the default, you will see the white dots appear one after the other. As you increase the slider, the particles start to appear almost at the same time. There's a slight time delay, but it is great for effects that are like explosions. Now, the good thing about these particles is that they are directional, so we can rotate the particles node and the particles will emit relative to that. So I'm going to reset the rotation. And if we play the game, you can see that we do spawn the particles away from the sword, from where the sword hit. We do that using a function on the enemy called knockback. It takes a position, the position from which the enemy was knocked back, and we use that to update the particle's rotation. So we get the angle to the position, and well, we add pi to make it the right direction. Same thing, we use that to set a pushback force that's going to push the enemy away from the source position received by the function. As a next layer, we have a label that you can spawn when attacking the enemy that shows the inflicted damage. If your game has damage points like these, this can be helpful to see exactly how much damage you dealt to the enemy. But this is something really secondary and depends on your game. I want instead to show you another effect that's much more important to me. It's the freeze frames or time slowdown when hitting an enemy. So here's my main game script, the one at the root of the game, in this demo at least. And when we hit the enemy, we emit a signal called enemy hit. We use a pattern called the signal bus. We register an autoload node that has signals that allow us to connect globally to events that happen in the game. So this allows me to know when an enemy was hit without connecting to the enemy hit signal of every enemy in the game. I just connect to the event bus autoload node. And when the enemy gets hit, we call a function called freeze engine, could be freeze frame or time slowdown. And what this does is it slows down time in the game for a very short amount of time. So to do that, you set the engine.timescale to a value below 1. And to reset the time to normal, you set back the time scale to 1. And in the middle, we create a timer that's going to slow down time, right? So you can see right here that I have a slight freeze when attacking the enemies. I can exaggerate the effect just so you see it a little better in the video. This really feels like a super critical hit, like on a boss. If you hit their weak spot, you could use an effect like that, but it's a bit too exaggerated. A value of 0.3 doesn't feel too bad. You really read the attacks. So if you had fast attacks in your game, it would feel a little too much, so you might want to use that sparingly. Still, a couple of freeze frames or a couple of frames with the time slowed down can feel really great. Going back to the sword, there's one last thing that I want to show you. So I'm in the sword scene on the sword script, and this is this line. This line is going to animate the sword going up and down like this. So I have some kind of idle animation and gives the game a bit more life. The enemies could also benefit from an animation. And this trick is pretty cool. So you can see that the tip of the sword is always facing towards the mouse, right? And that we animate the position of the sword, but it's like the handle is moving up and down. And you can achieve that this way. We have a pivot node that's placed around the base of the sword. Or more precisely, we have sprites that are aligned to have the handle correspond to the sword's pivot. We can use that to rotate the sword for slashing attacks or to look at the mouse, right? So that's what we do. We call the look at function on the pivot, and we look at the mouse position. You get it with this function here. And then we change the position of the pivot using the sine function. It's going to create a wave-like motion, and this is what makes the sword move up and down. But now, because the sword is trying to look at the mouse, the tip of the sword is always going to be facing the mouse. It feels like it's the handle hovering, and that's a pretty cool effect that you can use in some circumstances. And there's one last thing that's, of course, absolutely essential. It's the sound. I've reactivated it here, and now you can hear the slash. Hopefully it's not too loud in the video. For the sound, well, you have to find a sound that matches your attack. This one is not necessarily amazing, but well, having a slash sound is better than nothing for a sword. It really makes a big difference, as you can hear and see. You can find this open source demo on our website. You'll find a link in the description below. If you want to learn more about game creation, check out our courses. They sponsor these free videos. We have Learn to Code from Zero if you're relatively new to programming. This is a very complete course to teach you how to code from zero, how to make games with Godot. And if you are more experienced, you will really love Godot Node Essentials. It's a knowledge base that shows you the concrete things you can do in games with Godot's many nodes. You'll find links to both courses in the description below.